Scramble by I Had Him on the Ropes, Carter Reed, and Rory Gone Maddie, Destined Days. Chapter 15. Day 3000. There wasn't a cell in Bruce's body that didn't burn. Every fiber, every tendon, every ground down joint and grating socket was sandpaper under his skin. Pain had been an old friend, but she was a mistress now. His calluses had bloomed, stretching and merging, holding hands across his palms, burrowing deep and blistering just badly enough that 3 had already burst against the hard metal of the cane he leant so heavily upon. The thick tang of metal dancing with his tonsils and clawing at his tongue made him want to dry heave. But the empty hollowness in his stomach told him nothing but bile would emerge if he did. There had been no time to eat much before, when he'd been hooked up to IVs again, flushing more poisons from his system, a worried Alfred lingering over his shoulder, and his boys, all of them, perched to one side with expressions that screamed of concern. The Joker had been cruel, his gas permeating Gotham in a fog, and left an already wounded Bat scrambling for safety. He'd won, in the end, but even he wondered at what cost. There was little sympathy after. Clark had stopped by when papers ran news of Bruce's apparent sporting accident, but even he had been shocked at the extent of the damage. He'd rotated with his family, playing nursemaid and ignoring the dripping vitriol that slipped from the billionaire's lips at the feeling of vulnerability, at the shake in his hands and the bone-deep ache in his soul. He'd not commented on anything until he learned Bruce intended to be back in society much faster than his body could handle. He'd been relocating his shoulder. He'd moved too quick, and he'd not been ready. The stairs had evaded him underfoot when the cave alarms had chimed, announcing Clark's arrival. There was a moment before... "You cannot seriously be considering attending this thing!" The reporter sighed, incredulous and even reaching intimidating in the dark black suit he'd donned for the gala.
"Bruce Wayne had a minor skiing accident,"
Bruce replied deadpan.
"And would have been cleared by now."
"Bruce Wayne is an idiot," Clark retorted quietly, inching forward before casting his eyes over the man. "You still have 5 broken ribs!"
"I know."
"You're lucky your lung wasn't punctured."
"I know."
"And your ankle is still sprained."
"Funnily enough, I noticed that too."
Clark pursed his lips. "You're a stubborn fool."
"In other news, water
wins,"
Dick chimed in, barely glancing up from the computer. "You haven't even got to the poisons still running through his bloodstream."
Bruce hissed, turning on his son.
"Snitch,"
he accused, glaring when Dick only shrugged, smirking a little in reply. "The new tests show poison!" Clark had his eyes going wide. "Absolutely not! This is ridiculous! You should be in bed!"
"No," Bruce retorted, standing and ignoring the flare of pain carving its way up his leg.
"Bruce!"
"No."
"This is..."
"Are we going to have a discussion about the meaning of the word no?"
he asked, letting an eyebrow jump up into his hairline. Clark scowled. "Jerk!" And that had been that. Clark had left, still unimpressed at Bruce's life choices, and the billionaire had gingerly shuffled into the back of a limo, ignoring the writhing pit that was his stomach, which still, after 6 days, could take nothing more than thin watery soup and soft half-mashed banana. He hurt in ways he'd not hurt since Bane put a knee into his back, since the Court of Owls left him brainless and bleeding in their maze of hell, since he'd writhed under an icy sun further from Gotham than he'd ever been before. But still, he pulled on the mask hard. The gala was important, weren't they all? But unlike many others, there was little way for Bruce to avoid attendance. Fox had been clear and brutal in his explanation. Stock was plummeting, and maintaining the Bat, the League, and all other WE projects were conditional upon profit, upon healthy growth. The board wanted Wayne charm, wanted his presence, apparently, like he was a pampered cat brought out to be petted by others. And petted he was. The hall dripped with opulence. Gold and diamonds and pearls hanging from necks and ears and fingers glinted beneath candlelight. Outrageous fashion framed by illegal fur and scale-skin purses. The bright red lipstick of a matriarch like blood on a canvas. The tight curls of an up-and-coming, wet behind the ears and trying too hard, wearing the wrong suit, the wrong tie, but still slipping into conversation like he belonged. But between the gaps, slipping in and out of sight, balance. The lanyards looped over rented tuxes, pens jutting from pockets, recorder tucked just out of sight, reporters so out of place amongst the once percenters but holding their own, pushing back against the too wealthy and letting smiles pull at their lips when their targets squirmed about positive social outreach, conservation, and animal rights. It was a dance that Bruce had been practicing his entire life, his shoes squeaking against the newly polished marble floor, too white, too bright, too unblemished, and Kane echoing out faint taps felt both out of place and right at home. He had barely enough flesh to keep himself knitted together, and it apparently showed. He bore the sympathy from his peers, biting down at the rising sense of frustration at their pandering, as though they knew what it felt like to be poisoned by a lunatic. He bore the fake smiles and returned them with one of his own, parroting lines about being distracted by beautiful people on ski slopes, and his cane being in part a fashion statement. He was insipid and crass and shallow. He was everything he was expected to be. He saw Hal Jordan pass by him an hour in, face pulled into a scowl at his actions, and Bruce let himself feel amusement at the man's continued ignorance of his double life, at the League's ignorance. Clark, it turned out, was as committed to maintaining Bruce's identity as the billionaire was himself. In the past 5 years, the Kryptonian had even managed to save it, reaching him just before the cowl was wrenched from his face not once, but twice. He'd punched the perpetrators for good measure, too. They'd been pulling drywall from their muscle tissues for weeks.
"You look like death,"
Clark muttered, sidling up to him and giving him the once-over.
"and I can hear your ribs scraping against one another from across the room."
Bruce huffed out a laugh. "I'm sorry my injuries are distracting you." Clark only offered an unimpressed look in reply.
"You should tell them to stop grabbing at you,"
he continued after a moment.
"Your Ukrainian friend nearly dislocated your elbow."
"She's enthusiastic."
"She's going to enthusiastically separate your joints if you're not careful."
"I've got this," Bruce replied with a heavy breath, ignoring the flash of hot pain in his chest at the motion. Clark rolled his eyes and offered only a soul-suffering sigh in return before falling into silence and letting his gaze wander out towards the dance floor. "Don't worry," the man added after a moment.
"I'm not,"
he returned. Bruce chuckled lightly, shifting his weight with a hiss and trying to ignore the way his hands screamed as the cane pushed hard at his swollen palms. "Yes, you are." A half smile.
"All right, I am. I'd ask for you to let me help, but..."
He trailed off, distracted by tracking the movement of 2 board members, models on their arms, who were all clearly eager to engage in the W.E. magnate. "You can help with them." Bruce snorted offhand and gritting his teeth a little in pain. A laugh, features turned bright with humor, and Bruce's heart swooped at the sight.
"Don't worry, I've got you."
He smiled, amused, his tone teasing and kind. "You're safe," he added.
"Nothing's going to hurt you now."
Bruce didn't get a chance to react because there were board members pushing their way forwards, talking too loudly, and letting the women drag their hands down his front until Clark jumped in, oozing fake nerves and pushing up his glasses.
"I'm sorry, gentlemen, but this is very embarrassing, sirs. Ma'am, well, I was interviewing Mr. Wayne here, and, well, golly, if my editor doesn't get information on your latest drug rehabilitation program for the man himself, well, then I'll be out of a job."
He ended with a chuckle, all Kansas charm and innocence. The men all laughed, wine glasses tilting in their hands, flushed faces accepting the dismissal. They laughed, winked, and eventually walked off, tossing promises to Bruce of talking later, taking their dates with them. They seemed pleased, but then again they'd wanted him there to speak with press, to make WE and the board look good, to look investment worthy, to look like good partners. They weren't going to interfere. Clark met Bruce's gaze and shrugged, like it was nothing. Like him turning invasive upper-class assholes around was just another day in the office. Like giving him a moment to himself wasn't newsworthy, and it happened before. Like Brucey Wayne was worthy of defense. The journalist had changed in the past 5 years, and Bruce took the moment to simply observe his companion beside him, ignoring the unvoiced questions when Clark met his eyes. He tracked the gray that had begun to pepper the black hair, threading in and out of view, tracking amongst the locks tastefully and making him look distinguished. It curled in places in the adorable way it did sometimes, and there was an itch in the billionaire's hand that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with the desire to run his fingers through his soulmate's hair. Bruce had seen Clark's hair rumpled, windswept, and freshly awoken, and all of them triumphed the slicked-back neatness of his formal wear. Bruce wanted to mess it up. He wanted to see Clark, not the reporter who stood before him. His eyes, still the same bright baby blue that drew in the innocent and promised them salvation, the same enduring certainty bleeding through the irises, were encircled by crow's feet, a hint of the age that was beginning to creep up on Clark. The age that had already pinned Bruce to the wall by his neck was offering a gentle embrace to the alien. The man of steel was still broad, still powerfully built and packed muscle, but there was a softness to his frame, a blurred edge that made him appear gentle and huggable, a notion Bruce had found increasingly attractive over the years they'd spent building a universe-defining friendship. A friendship that had saved planets and ended conflicts, that had captured the attention of media and Mongols and metahumans, but was neither explained nor understood by any of them. A friendship that had been painstakingly built on respect, boundaries, and patience. A friendship that had been built on love. Because ultimately that's where they were now. Where they always had the potential to be. Where Bruce wanted them to be. It didn't take much thought for Bruce to reach out and hook their little fingers together. A small, simple thing. Bruce felt 6 again, with grazed knees and a schoolboy crush, writing notes to pass in class, asking whether Clark wanted to be his boyfriend. The man visibly stalled from fiddling with his recorder, eyes immediately dropping to the side. He looked equally young and unsure, and Bruce didn't hesitate then to entwine their fingers. "We're holding hands," Clark said dumbly. "Yes." "Why are we holding hands?" "I'm tired," Bruce breathed, squeezing once, tight. "And I'm old, and you, Clark Kent, are the love of my life." Clark's smile was tentative, right up until it was blinding. Then it eclipsed everything. It burnt through the pain and the aches, and it settled in his bones. He felt calm and warm and, dare he say it, complete. Bruce. It was reverence. It was disbelief. It was hope. It was everything. A declaration, a promise, a lifelong wait, finally coming to an end. There were tears in his eyes. There were tears making paths down his cheeks, and Bruce could feel the matching set running down the bridge of his nose. "Worth the wait?" he asked, taking a step closer and letting himself fall. "Worth every second." 3 weeks later, the headlines of every world paper were crying out in horror, desperate and lamenting over the loss of the superhuman protector that it had relied so heavily upon to be their beacon in the dark. "Where is Superman?" they asked. "Man of Steel missing!" Even, "Is the last son of Krypton dead?" And when he sees them, their bold claims nailed to the side of Gotham buildings under a dark and starring sky, Dick smiles beneath the cowl. End of Scramble by I Had Him on the Ropes, Carter Reed, and Rory Gone Maddie, Roast Tinted Days. If you enjoyed this recording or the content, feel free to write a comment below or a review at the original story from the link in the descriptions. Thank you for listening.